With me today are Sela, Matt, Rebecca, Tito, Ariel, and Rochir. And with that, I call this House to order once more and call upon the Prime Minister to open this debate. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Barack Obama says that there is no military solution in Iraq, one wonders what other kind of solution there could possibly be. At the point where IS is crucifying Christians, at the point where our neighbors like Jordan and our allies are being flooded with 500,000 Assyrian Christians, where Turkey is being flooded by refugees, and where IS takes towns every day with the Kurdish Peshmerga unable to defend themselves, we wonder what kind of solution Mr. Obama is envisaging. In opening government, we want to talk about 4 things in my speech. First, we want to talk about the problem insofar as the way that ISIS has developed, why that's an issue. Second, we want to discuss how power-sharing agreements will necessarily be ineffective in Iraq, and how, therefore, splitting it up is the only way. Then we want to talk about why the United States has this responsibility, and lastly, why it will be successful. First, I have a 5-point mechanism. We will be partitioning into 3 states on the basis of population. We will have a Kurdish state, we will have a largely Sunni state, and a largely Shia state. There's already a degree of decentralization and institutions which the United States put in place in the first place when trying to implement a power-sharing type agreement. We will use those. Second, we will draft constitutions which explicitly mandate minority rights. We are going to also have protection in these. We are going to put massive amounts of money into building the civil infrastructure of these new states. Third, we will have multilateral peace accords between the 3 nations, meaning that they are not allowed to go to war with each other. Fourth, we will have a mandatory disarmament. Within that, we will also say that if one state aggresses onto any of the other 2 states, they will have the United States military backing immediately. They will be under our umbrella. Then lastly, we will have water sharing and oil sharing agreements, similar to what is in place in South Sudan with that partition. As a result of that, we already have very similar agreements in place, which puts the oil throughout Iraq. We can use similar systems. On to our substantive. The problem is ISIS. No. Is it an important clarification? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, 3 questions. 1, are you going to...
No, sit down. You get 1 point of clarification. 3 is far too many. Okay, so, problem ISIS, right? We think that there is currently a situation where ISIS has simply overwhelmed the ability of the Iraqi forces to fight back, right? We think that there's a few issues with this. Mainly, the fact that the United States government has largely been relying on the Peshmerga in Iraqi Kurdistan to be able to push them off. They will not be able to, and they will fall. This is why, right? So, the Peshmerga has a 600-mile border with ISIS right now. Sit down. And they number at most about 90,000, and that's they're not all particularly well trained because they haven't largely been funded by a centralized government. They're better trained than any other Iraqi forces, but they're still not that great. As a result of that, we've seen things like the Mosul Dam being taken. We've seen various no thank you, Kurdish towns being taken by ISIS. We think that the only other option that we have got right now is obviously we cannot allow IS to overrun Iraq and become effectively a very radical, insane puppet state where they're the most brutal jihadists that the world has probably ever seen, right? So what are the other options we have? Potentially drone strike. The problem with that is IS can hide. They only numbered about 10,000, but they're incredibly opportunistic and very good at fighting in guerrilla warfare. As a result of that, reconnaissance units will have to be dispatched by the US and by the Kurdish Peshmerga to flush them out of the open so then the drones can get them. At that point, you already have a US ground invasion of Iraq. We think that in the status quo, the United States is already going to have to militarily intervene. The question we have on side proposition is what should we do after? We think this is a better situation than that which will leave us. No thank you. We think that we will wipe out IS. There are only about 10,000 fighters. With a good effort, we will be able to do so. Second, power sharing agreements will be ineffective and help IS necessarily. Power-sharing agreements generally tend to entrench division within people, but this is particularly true in situations like Iraq, where it is highly volatile, where there has been a power vacuum created. What does that mean, right? We think there's serious distrust distrust between communities, which is very legitimate, right? So obviously it is the case that she has suffered under the reign of Saddam Hussein. It is also the case that Sunnis massively suffered under Maliki's incredibly corrupt Shia-backed rule, which was backed by the United States. As the Kurdish have been obviously messed over by both forces. For instance, when Saddam Hussein gassed their people, we think the likelihood that there will be serious trust between these these three communities is very implausible. Particularly because of the fact that it is usually the case. The reason we have power sharing agreements is because we don't have a better option, right? Because people are already living together and there aren't clear regions where they could be. There aren't clear states that could potentially exist. In this situation, there are those clear states that could potentially exist, right? There are some towns which are on the border which have mixed populations, which is why we want to have minority protections, but it is still better under our model than it is under their model. We think that there is severe dissatisfaction with Maliki, which makes it as a result that IS is sort of going around and freeing Sunni prisoners who were put into prison by Maliki, and as a result of that, are able to get fighters as they go along, as they also raid the Iraqi armed forces because they're so ineffective that they're unable to do anything. I'll take closing.
Okay, right. So you claim that the ISIS are really strong and we can't do anything about it. Very recently, we've seen with a little bit of funding, they've already taken back the Mosul down and are already pushing the forces back. Why on earth is this necessary when clearly the Kurds with a little bit of arms can push them back?
Right, this is clearly not the case, right? If that were true, we would have done that before and then ISIS would have continued to be pushed back. The fact that they're incredibly opportunistic means everyone who's a political strategist is terrified of the effect of ISIS, right? In fact, they've been able to tear through Iraq. They were on nobody's radar really until 2 months ago, and now there's a serious possibility they will overtake a country. I just dispute the premise of your question, right? So why the US has the responsibility? The responsibility to protect itself is because the fact that sectarianism was furthered by the United States creating a power vacuum in Iraq the first time we went in and had absolutely no idea or no exit plan of how we were going to get out. We left weak civil services, we left weak institutions, and we left a military which was undisciplined and unable to fight back against threats like IS. We think it's going to be successful under our model because these institutions are already in existence. At the point that you are able to break them away, then you don't have the same kind of ethnic tension where every single thing becomes politicized between whether or not a bridge that you're building or a dam or a water supply is going to be going to which of these ethnic groups, right? We think that it is only under this situation that you are able to break these horrifying sectarian ties which insist that Iraq will persist to be in a state of volatility despite the fact that they are also in the most tense region in the world. It is in the United States security interest to make sure that the state of Iraq does not fall to Sunni extremists. It is in the US security interest to make sure that we have a secular democratic Iraqi Kurdistan and two well-established Sunni and Shia states in the south. It is in the United States' interest that we ensure to partition Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister very much for the speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear. I thank the Leader of Opposition very much. Before I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister, I'd like to remind everyone that these tables are old, so try to bang less enthusiastically, unfortunately, even though the spirit is good. So, with that, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Speaker, that side of the House can stand up and try to make us look silly by saying, oh, there's a new government in Iraq, and you guys didn't realize that. One, we did realize that, right? The reason why that it's not, why the point that he was trying to make there is not important is because the new government is also Shia, right? Which means that all of the problems that he was talking about in terms of the fact that a Shia government is one of the things that's caused the rise of ISIS is obviously irrelevant when you have a continuation of a Shia influence within that government. The next thing is that we think that the Iraqi government, as it stands, has shown that they are completely toothless and completely unable to fight ISIS as it currently stands. And that's why on our side of the House, we are proud to stand for an America that will stand up and help to bring about an end to the major crisis that we see unfolding at the moment. There are three things that I'm going to talk about in my speech today. The first one is the nature of this problem, why we think it's been mischaracterized by that side of the House and why we think they are excessively optimistic about the ability to deal with this in any other way. The next thing I want to take a look at is the idea we had from that side of the House that we think that they think Iraq is going to over time simply evolve into an autonomous entity. Why it is that they've provided absolutely no compelling narrative for how that will ever happen, and on our side of the House we've given you instead a very compelling narrative for how we can bring about not an autonomous entity, but instead something that is a lot more peaceful and a lot more plausible. Finally, I want to take a look at why we think there is a major responsibility to intervene here and the principal justification that we're standing for on this side of the House. So to begin with, Malena told you very clearly at the beginning of this debate that it is not viable to rely on the Peshmerga, right? She told you that there are only 90,000 troops there, and it is absolutely false and like just a factual lie, which I can refute no other way, to when they stand up and say that there are double that number, right? Even if there are double that number, that is still like not an adequate number of troops to deal with a 6,000-mile border, which is what they're currently having to defend. Moreover, though, what we told you is that even like regardless of the number, they're also not particularly well trained, right? Why is that important? It's important because even if it means that sometimes they can like take back some areas using the amount of force that they do have, they don't necessarily have like the kind of strategic military capability to upscale into like a more strategic or a more widespread fight for for their areas. The other thing, though, is that we think it's incredibly problematic that their solution to deal with this, which relies on the Peshmerga, is simply to continue to pour arms into this kind of situation, right? We think that when you have huge ethnic tensions that are not going away anytime soon, and when you have like massive amounts of militarism already, we think that it's really bad to just like keep getting more and more arms floating around in the hands of the kinds of organizations that you're talking about, instead of organizations like the United States military, who we think are like a little bit better and a little bit more trustworthy in the way that they're going to hang on to those things. No, thank you. The final thing. The final thing, though, is that we think that a lot of those points are kind of conceded by that side of the House when they say that they're willing to, and they agree that it's necessary to go in and to use drone strikes and to continue these kinds of targeted strikes, right? The fact that they want to do anything at all like that concedes the fact that the Peshmerga cannot on their own be relied on to do this kind of thing. So we think it's bizarre that they've rested so much of their case on relying on them. No, thank you. The next thing that we want to tell, moreover, though, so that's why we think that the nature of Peshmerga is such that we cannot rely on them. Moreover, though, what we think is that in terms of the nature of ISIS, those guys have massively underestimated them in a number of ways, right? We told you that they're incredibly good at hiding and incredibly good at urban warfare. The reason for that is that they've been training for years in Syria, right? They're really good at hiding from airstrikes because that's what you have to do all the time in Syria, right? They do stuff like hiding their, they have a whole lot of practices related to the way they hide Humvees in garages and stuff like that. We think that that's the reason why you absolutely have to have boots on the ground that are flushing these organizations out into the open. Yes, obviously it's going to be regrettable if they, obviously we're not necessarily going to be like invading Syria as well, and therefore we can't on our side of the house take on the burden of entirely decimating ISIS in its entirety. But we think if we can completely flush it out of Iraq, if we can get it back over the border so that it's only in Syria, we can start to rebuild an Iraq that is a lot more stable in the long term, and we're really proud to stand by that. No, thank you. What I want to move on to now is the idea of the idea that this side of the house put forward of Iraq just kind of organically evolving into an autonomous entity, which is apparently what they think is going to happen if we just leave the status quo to play out. Here's the reasons why we don't think that's a very plausible narrative. I'll take you in a minute. Firstly, it's because we think power sharing has consistently failed, right? And there are very obvious reasons for that. The main one being that there is absolutely no trust, and nor should there necessarily be that much trust between the different parties who are involved in this conflict. So the fact that Sunnis have been consistently screwed over by Maliki, the fact that Shias have been consistently screwed over by Hussein, the fact that Kurds have been consistently screwed over by everyone means that there is absolutely no reason why those parties are ever going to buy in to the kind of trust that is necessary to make power sharing work. And that kind of power sharing is what brings around the peace that eventually lets nation building happen, right? We think that when you can't get that first step, you're never going to get the evolving national identity that that side of the house would like to see happen. Yes?
Okay, so the last time the USA tried to engage with people who were very good guerrilla fighters was in Vietnam, right? And they were there for over a decade and still couldn't defeat them, and had to stay there for 10 years and have all of the harms that come with that. Why do you think that's not going to happen here?
Well, for a whole variety of reasons, right? The first one being that military strategy and military technology has come a really long way since then, right? Moreover, when you look at the kinds of organizations we're dealing with, and you look at the fact that the US is engaged in a whole lot of areas in this part of the world, we think that the strategies that they're able to employ, yeah, obviously it's a difficult task, right? But we think the fact that it's such a difficult task is the very reason why you can't rely on 90,000 Peshmergas to do it all for you. It's, yeah, obviously difficult on both sides of the house. Moreover, though, what we think, if we take a look at how best we start to try to overcome the lack of trust that we see between these parties, that's going to bring about the kind of longer-lasting peace that that side of the house want to see, we think the beauty of our solution, right, is that you don't need to wait for the evolution of that coherent national identity, right? You don't need to wait for Iraq to become an autonomous entity. You accept the fact that it's never going to be one, and that it's just a quirk of the arbitrariness of map drawing and history that it is one at the moment, and instead you say we should draw borders that better align with national identities, and in doing so we are able to facilitate all of the things that need to happen in terms of the kinds of peace agreements that Marlena talked to you about. We think that a United States that is able to take a strong stance in Iraq now, and that is then able to back independent states, is one that is going to be a force for peace in the region, in the world, and we're really proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much, and I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
ladies and gentlemen, what Keris gives you in her speech is a narrative about what ISIS is about and what Iraq's problems are about, which is overwhelmingly centred on the West. And that's just not the true narrative. And what we're going to do in extension is show you how the problems of Iraq are fundamentally based in Iraq, and the problems that ISIS gets its support in response to are problems that you do solve by partition, and that you can only solve by partition. 3 things in this speech with substantive and rebuttal sort of interwoven, but I'll get more substantive as we go. So firstly, this looks funnier on my page than it is to say, but is ISIS something to worry about? The letter IS for it's good. Secondly, will this work? Will we be able to effectively invade and partition Iraq? Thirdly, how does partition create a lasting solution to the problems in Iraq? So, is ISIS something we should worry about? Because we get various ideas at opening up that basically we don't need to. The first thing we hear is that we shouldn't at all be worried about them. They're really small, they're disparate groups, most of their fighters are actually fighting for other things. We'd still tell you 3 things, as our opening mentioned, right? They're still incredibly brutal. They're still killing people and causing huge numbers of refugees to be driven into neighbouring states. That's terrible. They're still taking huge swathes of territory, right? And they're still causing so many deaths and so many displaced persons that the idea that they can't threaten seriously Iraq's status as a state just flies in the face of the reality on the ground right now. Okay, so the next thing they tell us, perhaps realising that that's absurd, is that we don't need to worry about them any longer. We've just retaken Mosul down, we've got a new prime minister. The crucial thing here is that the improvements that have been made have only been made in Iraqi Kurdistan, where the Peshmerga are, where those well-trained forces are, where US airstrikes are being concentrated, where US arms are being delivered. There is nothing happening in Tikrit on the road to Baghdad, where there are just as many people who are in desperate need of help and aren't getting it at all. So this is the third thing they say, is we don't need to fuss about this too much because the Peshmerga can do it. Okay, they're good, but they're struggling. There's not that many of them. They don't have the capacity to fight forever. That's what our opening tell you. But moreover, outside Kurdistan, they do nothing. They can't, and they don't want to, because they don't like the other ethnic groups in Iraq. More on that later, but they're fundamentally about protecting their own people in the Kurdish area of Iraq, not about protecting the other children dying, the other refugees who are just as much in need of help, and who their non-proposal does nothing to say. This is a huge deal. Moreover, the other tensions that existed prior to ISIS, and if we don't act to partition and remove their long-term cause, are also a huge deal. Secondly, will this work? Not too long on this, because basically what we want to tell you is that the overwhelming force and the overwhelmingly better training that the US military can apply, and the technological advantage that they have, just means that they will be able to smash ISIS extremely effectively, drive them back into Syria, if that's what they want to talk about. I'll explain later why that's actually a good thing. But moreover, we think that it will be effective in removing the root causes of this conflict, because this is a partition which will take away the incentives that people had to join ISIS, to support that group. Okay, Gareth and Keris tells us, okay, driving ISIS into a largely Sunni area is bad. Okay, we'd say 2 things. Firstly, if they're so weak, we won't drive them into a largely Sunni area of Iraq. We'll smash them and drive them out of Iraq altogether. They tell us that ISIS are no good. That's what we'll do. But secondly, we'd tell you, even if they are in a Sunni area, Sunnis won't love ISIS so much, won't have a reason to join ISIS once you take away the Shia government that has been repressing them for the better part of a decade. Those tensions don't exist when you give them their own government. Those problems don't arise. Then they tell you, Keris, this is great, Keris tells you and says, they'll feel things that are being unfairly divided, they'll have problems. It's already the case that people think that the divisions being made within Iraq are not fair. That's the driver that is fundamentally at the root of this conflict. And finally, she says, well, even if you can destroy ISIS, you can't destroy the rhetoric that gives rise to ISIS. We literally can. That's exactly what we do. Because the rhetoric that gives rise to ISIS is not mostly about the West or Islam against the West. The idea of a caliphate is not something that has appeal for most Muslims. What does have appeal is the fact that you are materially losing out every day because the government that governs your country doesn't care about your religion, is oriented against you and people like you. And that inequality and that split of resources is what drives people to acquiesce, to fight alongside ISIS like they tell you. That's what we remove. So, onto that. How does this partition create a lasting solution? Before that, Gareth.
The rhetoric and ideology of ISIS is that of resistance. That is what you give them when you conquer them and kill hundreds of thousands of people, rather than, as we want to do, contain them. We're not opting someone else should invade.
Okay. I mean, it's not that important what the rhetoric of ISIS is. What's fundamentally important is the reasons that people have to join ISIS, which isn't about what ISIS wants or about the stated goals of ISIS, but about the people and the way that they're reacting to the situation that they face and why they're driven to join that group. It's not because they love ISIS, it's not because they want an Islamic State to spread like across the entire mapped area that Islamic State has planned. That's not what it's about. It's about the material losses that those people face. Okay, how does partition create a lasting solution? Let's tell you what we get without partition. You get governments that are inevitably Shia. It's a Shia majority country that doesn't elect Sunni governments. So you get Sunnis not trusting them because for a decade they've been oppressed. For a decade they have got the worst end of material resource splits. You get Kurds who don't trust them and who argue about the borders of their autonomous regions and often fight against that government. That's not going anywhere, right? Successive governments have failed to share rights and treat Sunnis fairly. That is a permanent perception which is coloured by the history of conflict between those groups in that country, coloured by what happened when Saddam Hussein was in charge. So the fact that there's a new government, a new name, and a new face doesn't change that underlying dynamic, the permanent perception that a government that isn't from your group cannot treat you fairly. Importantly also though, that's been coloured by events now. The Shia hate the Sunni because, as Gareth tells you, they're acquiescing and fighting alongside ISIS. And the Sunni, especially in light of that, never trust that government and return to oppositional politics. So even if ISIS is not a thing, you still get that underlying dynamic which means that conflicts like it will always divide Iraq. What do you get with partition? You get religiously and ethnically divided states which immediately give people a sense of ownership and national coherence, create homogenous communities where those kinds of tensions don't arise, which give people their own government that does treat them fairly on that basis. Remove that need to fight over governments. Importantly, you strengthen their armies. One of the reasons the Iraqi army is so useless at resisting ISIS is not that it doesn't have the troops or the technology, but that it is divided ethnically and doesn't have the will to fight or the will to be organised properly in order to resist. You fix that when you get nationally coherent armies. You take away future ISIS by removing those underlying problems. Regionally, Syria, okay, maybe they retreat into Syria, but losing the capacity to flip between those regions is a huge blow when you strengthen the armies that they have to face on the border with Kurdistan and the border with northern Iraq by making those undivided, coherent communities with better armies more able to resist. You hurt ISIS, you make the region better, you make Iraq better. We're incredibly proud to propose.
Wow, pretty bad idea, huh? Yeah. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about why this is unnecessary, why the things that we're doing at the moment are pretty good at getting rid of ISIS, why we think that actually ISIS is probably going to fall apart amongst itself at the point where it doesn't have any funding, at the point in which there's no real reason to foresee its continued existence as a meaningful entity with the things that we're doing. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why their policy makes lives for Iraqis massively worse in the short term. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why their policy, should it work, makes lives massively worse in the long term, including talking about the partition. One extraneous point of rebuttal as I go, because the Oxford case relies on the idea that the status quo is crippling Sunni-Shia relationships, and so an invasion is going to sort that out, right? But the problem is, right, that when an American invasion happens, America is seen as a predominantly Shia actor. Why do we know this? Because the recent invasion of Iraq by America led to a situation where you had a government which led to policies which massively improved the lives of Shias and disenfranchised disenfranchise Sunnis. We just don't see it as true, as likely that when the Americans come in, Sunnis are going to believe that they're going to get a fair deal out of this partition, they're going to get any meaningful control of important resources like oil and water, or any meaningful access to economic benefits for their lives. That's going to be important, and that's why they're going to lose this debate. Right, so why do we think that this is unnecessary? So the first thing, like, we've got quite a lot of them not being able to defend themselves from the ISIS onslaught at the moment, right? First of all, we point out, as opening do, that's patently not true. There means one strategic retreat and then came back, but we think that there are serious reasons to suppose why ISIS are likely to implode. First off, they have no obvious leader, they have no obvious ideology. There are serious reasons why they are likely to start arguing at the point at which they get larger and take more power, right? We also think that funding of Kurdish and Iraqi forces, which, by the way, aren't ethnically divided, right? The Iraqi army is entirely Shia, right? Means that trained forces can overcome a force which, whilst like a bit large and evil, is untrained and ill-equipped, right? Notice that opening up very sensibly said that we're not looking to conquer ISIS, right? They will just destroy themselves. How do we know this? Because nobody in the Middle East wants to fund them. There isn't a single Middle East actor for whom it's in the rational self-interest to give money to a really unstable, evil organisation controlling swathes of the Middle East. It would absolutely destroy the region. But then they say that, like, the status quo just doesn't work because power sharing doesn't work. You say, first of all, neither does partitioning, and come on to that later, but second of all they showed was that bad power sharing doesn't work, right? That's why the new Prime Minister, Al-Haider, is setting up an efficient power sharing agreement which actually has Sunnis in the government. We'd quite like to give that a go, because we think that all the reasons why ISIS set up and start fighting are unlikely to be the case under that scenario. Right, why does it make lives for Iraqis worse in the short term? The first thing, they mention a lot about atrocities, right? Look, at the point at which the Americans come in, we think ISIS are going to try desperately to try and get them out. We think that at that point, if they're as evil as they say, they are massively incentivized to commit far more atrocities and far more crucifixions to try and scare the Americans off. They're likely to use tactics like human shields. Why do we think that those tactics are likely to be more effective? Because of the way that America chooses to fight wars, Mr. Speaker. It has a huge political incentive to minimise the loss of lives of its own citizens at the cost of collateral damage to Iraqi civilians. It tends to use a lot of air attacks, a lot of destruction of infrastructure, so that one American can die instead of 10 at the cost of a couple of hundred Iraqis in an unfortunate series of events. That's one reason why it improves the ISIS recruitment drive. But why are there other reasons why it's likely to improve the ISIS recruitment drive and make the problem much, much worse? We would point out that, number one, it is mainly operating in sunny areas of Iraq at the moment, and second of all, that America is seen in these regions as hugely pro-Shia, as I pointed out, because most recent invasion of Iraq led to the Sunni-dominated government. We say it's very unlikely that Sunnis on the ground are going to believe that they will get a fair deal, and the Sunni militias who are currently only deciding that they're going to attempt to defend their own communities are likely to defect to ISIS, because they're going to see that if the Americans win, you have this partition, their lives are going to get massively worse. Thirdly, we say at the point at which the Americans come in and overtake like the Iraqi state's attempt to fight off ISIS, you lose the faith in the Iraqi state's ability to fight them, and you cripple the trust in the new government at Baghdad. We say that's incredibly problematic given how fragile it is currently. Fourthly, we say that it just makes guerrilla war more likely given what I've previously said, because it means that ISIS become the popular actor, right? People will now allow them to hide in their homes, people, exactly like we saw with the Viet Cong and Vietnam. Compare this to a situation where we can arm reasonably efficient units to overcome ISIS in a way which is unlikely to be as divisive. We think we massively win in the short term on that front. No thanks, Marlena. Why do we think that we make it worse in the long term? So we think that this is going to be a prolonged invasion, right? The threat from ISIS is not going to go away just as soon as you take land. You need to be able to control that land. They're not even trying to control that land, by the way, because they said that they demilitarize everywhere. Like, when you demilitarize everywhere, all the ISIS people who just crossed the border into Syria are just going to come back and take all the stuff. That was really, really stupid, guys. Exactly like the Viet Cong did in Vietnam, right? They just go to the safe place and they hide, right? Unless they're proposing that the Americans are going to chase them across the Syrian border or try and hold the Syrian border. We just don't see why they've given an explanation as to why that won't happen. That means that you need sustained political capital in order to be able to stay, which we think is very unlikely, right? The response that we got to this was, oh, but we're better at war now, so it's not going to take ages. We think that claim probably needs some analysis, right? We think that Obama came under huge amounts of pressure to withdraw from Iraq when Americans kept dying time there, even though infrastructure hadn't been rebuilt, security of the north was non-existent, see the existence of ISIS now, and guerrilla war was continuing. All of these problems mean that America are likely to pull out far too early, leading to instability before Iraq has a chance to recover. The partition, right? And this is the interesting bit. So sunny Iraq has huge problems, right? The fact that it doesn't adjoin a coast, so it's dependent on the southern part of Iraq, allowing it to be able to transport resources from the coast to it. We say that given the divisions that they say exist, it's very incredibly likely that they're going to get blockades and have massive economic poverty, right? We also say that their water and oil sharing plans don't work, like they are currently not working in South Sudan because breaking the agreements is incentivized, because the threat from America that they will go in is an empty one, right? Third of all, we say that the sunny state is likely to end up being run by military leaders, right? Because their culture is defined on violence against them from Shias, because all leaders of local communities are the ones with guns who control the people with the guns. That's massively problematic, because even if you don't get, Mr. Speaker, cross-border conflicts between non-state actors, which we say you do, because we say it's likely to be incredibly unpopular and people are going to want to keep fighting, you're going to have political incentives to have war between those states. This is just a really bad idea.
We thank the member of opposition, and it's time for whipping, and we start with the government whip.
Better together is a lie. What our opening do very effectively is point out why there is an impetus for a US invasion and some of the benefits that would accrue from partition. What we bring you in closing government is a justification as to why this is the only solution to this problem and the specific mechanisms by this will lead to a lasting peace both in Iraq and the wider region. That's what wins us this debate. 5 things in this speech. First of all, responding to some of Richard's aggressive mischaracterizations, both of our case and of the current political situation. Then 4 areas of clash. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about the Islamic State. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why this is an invasion that will work. And then, actually, no, just 3. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about the necessities of partition, both for Iraq and the wider region. So first of all, in terms of rebuttal. Richard tells you that the reason the power sharing deals haven't worked in the past is because they were bad ones. This is a really good one. I think that's a pretty bold claim to make only a fortnight into its existence. But the problem that we see is that notions of power sharing lack credibility because of the history of failure of power sharing agreements. This one's just going to be like all the rest. You need a meaningful partition of the sort which we outline in order to have credibility. No. Secondly, he talks to you about how Iraqi lives are going to be made substantially worse under this policy. He tells you what's going to happen is that ISIS is going to be able to bump its recruitment, failing entirely to deal with Fergus's case as to how the main drive for joining ISIS is not the hatred of the West or not the desire for an Islamic caliphate, but of a response to what is perceived as an inequitable distribution of resources and of opportunities in Iraq's sit. Secondly, they tell you that Iraqi lives will be made worse in the long term, as there will never be faith in an Iraqi state which couldn't fight off ISIS on its own. The problem is that we're not supporting a new Iraqi state, we're supporting free. We are supporting free where there is divisions, we are supporting free where there is trust that you'll have a government that can represent you, that can treat you fairly for all of the reasons that Fergus gave you, and again, went on responded to sit. They tell you that the only other option is to have the Peshmerga fighting. Once again, we think that the Peshmerga are incredibly good at defending themselves. What they lack entirely is the impetus or the resources to defend wider Iraq. You've given us no reasons to believe otherwise, no thanks, carrots. Next, in terms of this stuff about demilitarization and how the US is never going to have the impetus to act in the long term. First of all, just on a very sort of meta-debatey level, we are assuming the necessary powers, and moreover, we are saying this is a policy which would be in the US's interest to carry to fruition. Secondly, what we would say, though, is we think this is a sort of policy which could be potentially popular with an electorate. We say the notion of crushing an organization which is as evil as ISIS, which is as militarized as ISIS, is a good one. No. The reason that the last Iraq war took so incredibly long is not because the initial crushing of a militarized group took so long, but because the sub-conflicts which emerged as a result of a dissatisfaction with the government that was set up, which was seen to be inequitably dividing resources between Sunnis and Shias, continue to stoke these tensions. We remove that on our side of the house. This is an easier conflict to fight than last time. This is a better solution. No thank you. So, also, this awful mischaracterization of Sunni culture as being exclusively a militarized one, not paying attention to the number of Sunni democratic leaders who do exist in Iraq, but aren't given a fair say in the government. We can give them a fair say. We think the Sunni state will be a peaceful one. No. So, moving on to the Islamic State, IS. We think we have a bit of a confusion on side proposition. Because at the one hand they say that they are strong enough that we're never going to be able to beat them, but on the other hand they say that given time it will collapse in on itself. We give you compelling reasons to think that the Islamic State is strong enough that it will not collapse in on itself, but we are a hell of a lot stronger and can beat them and do so effectively. A couple of reasons why they are currently strong. Whilst they have small numbers, they are very skilled, they are very brutal, no thank you, they are very good at tactics, they are very ideologically driven. Moreover, as Fergus tells you, they are well funded. It's simply not true they have no backers in the region. They don't have state backers, but they have incredibly rich Sunnis who are willing to donate to that cause, okay? We say we remove that on our side of the house and we can fight them, and we can fight them out of Iraq so they stop inflicting all the tragedies which are happening at the moment. But the important thing here is irrespective of whether or not ISIS does fall apart, the lingering memories of Sunni acquiescence to the actions of ISIS will always taint the ability of those two groups to interact in a unified Iraq. That's what gives us the impetus to have a divided Iraq. No. Moreover, as Fergus tells you, whilst it is the case that you may be able to fight the IS in the north, it is simply not the case that you can chase them out of Tikrit or Baghdad simply by giving the Peshmerga arms. You need a stronger solution in order to beat what is now a very entrenched and strong force. These guys say that the rhetoric will still survive. We agree. But no one's going to listen. You remove the impetus for that rhetoric, you remove the material causes which cause people to join ISIS, and they are going to collapse, and we will have a safer Iraq. Gareth.
When you occupy an area and commit atrocities and abuses, that drives people into the hands of the only people they think can defend them. That drives them to ISIS. You are going to unify a fraying group.
So, firstly, we think that we are going to smash ISIS to pieces very quickly. Secondly, we say that we are going to immediately set about the process of building states, which provide an immediate counter to the very narrative that ISIS thrives upon, okay? We are not going to have the sort of Sunni acquiescence or the joining of ISIS when we can actually offer people a genuine alternative. Here's why it is a genuine alternative. Here's why the invasion is going to work. As I've already extensively outlined, there is simply no other option. But as Fergus points out to you, the US is a whole lot stronger. Richard says, you're going to need to analyse that. Luckily, he already did when he told you why we're more experienced, have more firepower, have greater numbers, have the experience of being in Iraq before, have learned from those mistakes, have the ability to act and the ability to act decisively. Moreover, these guys say that the USA is always going to be seen as never going to be legitimate because it will always be seen as a tool of the Shias. Nonsense. It will be seen as explicitly breaking up a Shia-dominated government for its unfair treatment of Sunnis and Kurds. That is a powerful counter-narrative for the US to be able to engage in. It's simply not true that they will turn back to ISIS. Finally, in terms of why partitioning is necessary, Fergus tells you very extensively why the sense of inequitable treatment and the acquiescence and the memories of the acquiescence of Sunnis during this conflict will mean that you can never have a united Iraq. What happens when you divide it is give people a sense of ownership and belonging and control over their state. You have homogenous communities. Moreover, with the sorts of policies which Edinburgh built into their model of ensuring equal power sharing and of ensuring US oversight and non-aggression pacts, this is a peace which can be lasting and meaningful. People don't want to live in a continuing state of war, but they are willing to acquiesce to that when it is seen that they are being completely treated unfairly by the only other alternative. We give them fair treatment, we enable them to live happily. Finally, on this, in terms of Iraq potentially falling into the hands of ISIS and becoming a regional basket case, we are happy to line the Syrian border. As has been said, we are happy to drive them into Syria if necessary, but the problem comes when they're able to flit between the two. We crush ISIS, we make the region and Iraq a safer place. Mr. Speaker, it is an incredible honour to stand in this chamber and this round. It is an honour to stand alongside so many great friends, and it's an honour to side for something I genuinely support. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
I think the government will, and indeed the entire government will, and in order to finish off this debate, I call upon the opposition will. Hear, hear.
Rebuttal 1. Matt tells us the notion of power sharing is going to be seen as a failure. We say no, it's not. First of all, we say that because of America's previous history, the Sunnis are likely to see partition as a failure before it's even happened because they think it's been controlled by America. Comparatively, as Richard tells you, we commonly put in Baghdad, like Sunnis are being appointed to the government, and you say, oh, that only happened like 2 weeks ago. Yes, probably a good idea to let that work before you go in and destroy the country for the third time. Rebuttal number 2, right? They tell us that the main incentive to join ISIS is the unfair redistribution of resources in Iraq, right? But whilst that may be true to an extent, they will still assume this is worse under American control, right? Especially if America comes in, destroys loads of land, kills loads of civilians. That only necessarily increases that. Whilst we have of course knowledge of ISIS has recruitment drives at the moment, we're necessarily saying it makes it worse in the long run, right? Thirdly, we hear that like the biggest problem is that one of the biggest benefits is now, like, they see themselves as being able to control themselves, right? Like, own themselves in their 3 states, right? We think that if this were true, this might be a good idea, right? However, the reason it's not true is you don't have your own army, you're dependent on the USA for your own security. That's not any kind of self-autonomy or control whatsoever. So even that benefit doesn't exist. Finally, we hear this idea that, oh, it's okay, guys, we can, like, patrol the Syrian border and therefore any insurgencies aren't going to happen again, right? The Syrian border with Iraq and the new Iraq is absolutely massive, right? It's really not very difficult for like insurgents to cross the border and continue warfare in the long term. First point of clash. Why is this policy unnecessary, right? Opening government give us this idea that there's no other way of defeating them, but they don't actually do the comparative with the status quo situation, right? I already POI in the first speech or the second speech the idea that actually finally now that the US and Western states are willing to arm the Kurds, provide financial sources, already ISIS is being pushed back, right? No response to that whatsoever. But what we tell you in extension is firstly, why it's necessary, no thanks mate, why it's necessarily harder to hold land than it is to take it for ISIS, right? Why is this, right? Firstly, because of the reason Marlena tells us, right? She says that actually strategists were absolutely shocked because it just happened in 3 months, right? Which meant it was very easy for ISIS to take over this land because there was no one there protecting any of it. They weren't expecting it whatsoever. Now, however, as Richard tells you, we know they're there, right? It means that we finally have the ability to prepare for this, finally have the ability to deal with this, right? Richard tells you how this, under the status quo, the Iraqi army is necessarily strengthened and local people are willing to fight, right? Because, again, to begin with, the reason all of this land was taken up, right, because there was no one there, average people weren't taking up arms because it was taken off guard, right? But now these people want to defend their state, right? They're like, there is no way I want ISIS to take over, behead my family, and, make me live under, absolute Sharia law, right? There's no way they want that to happen. You don't give them a chance to do this. In fact, you necessarily worsen this when you go in with this policy, right? Moreover, we tell you why it is that, so opening up assert to you to an extent that ISIS will collapse by itself, right? Richard gives you 3 reasons why this happens, right? Firstly, he talks to you about where there's no clear leader or hierarchy. This is extremely important when you want to control land for a long period of time, right? It's very easy to have a revolution and take over land because everyone gets behind you. It's like, yay, arms, killing people, taking over land, right? But when you're actually trying to control that territory for long periods of time, not having a hierarchy, not having a clear structure is awful, right? Because you have infighting, you have factions forming, which necessarily mean that ISIS will continue to attack each other, attack one another, and break up from within, right? Secondly, Richard tells you have the self-interest of the individuals involved, right? Each person within ISIS is going to want lots of land in the region, or this particular house, this particular mansion, right? Which means that ISIS will very much struggle to continue to stay a stable part in the long run, right? Moreover, what we tell you is that given that we are finally able to arm them in the way that we have, right, they are suffering losses, right? Which means you already see lots of ISIS soldiers fleeing, right? Matt's only response to this is, oh, but they have a clear ideology, right? Well, when it's between having a clear ideology and, for example, your lives and the lives of your family, even for ISIS members going away, right, you're far more likely to abandon that post and go away. Moreover, we tell you that the Kurds, again, they say, oh, but the Kurds can only defend the north, right? No, that's not the case. When they helped Iraq fight Iran, they were supporting Baghdad, and we've given you reasons why it is that Baghdad will now be stronger as well, because you've got local militias and US aid going there to arm those people there. So we say that necessarily ISIS will be defeated. It may not be in 6 months, it may even take a couple of years, but it will occur, and it will occur in a more peaceful manner, right? But before I go on, I'll take Marlena.
Right, okay. At the point that identity groups have their own states with negotiated access to oil, water, and their security guaranteed, what incentive do they have to keep fighting for ISIS for these years that you are so happy to allow them to have control over the country?
Okay, I will get to that, but like very briefly, like the security is not guaranteed at all. Because all you've just asserted is America will protect them, right? The reason that's never going to happen is if you imagine skirmishes across the border or insurgencies, are the US Army really going to continue sending forces to Iraq again and again and again when they keep suffering losses and see this going on? There was no reason you gave us for why that would be the case. Why does this worsen life for Iraqis, right? Firstly, Richard tells you how the USA necessarily will prioritize its own soldiers' lives, which will lead to essentially like carpet bombing tactics, which lead to huge numbers of like Iraqi civilians dying. Richard explains to you how that necessarily increases the chance of like them deferring to ISIS, because it's like at least ISIS are our own and aren't like killing aren't killing our people necessarily in the way that like the US would be doing, because it'd be over large swathes of land, right? Matt tells us no, we have increased numbers and more experience, right? That's pretty useless compared to when you want to protect the life of a US soldier far more than you want an Iraqi citizen, right? When we invaded the last time, like hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died compared to like hundreds of US soldiers, right? Secondly, what Richard tells you is that ISIS will necessarily commit mass atrocities and use large numbers of human shields, right? Because they can see it as a way of scaring off the West, but also pinning it on the West, right? Every time they do that, every time like the US try to are invading and trying to take over them, they're like, look, we're killing tens of thousands until you leave. Comparatively, if we allow them to break up and if we allow them to like just get defeated by the Iraqi army, that's less likely to happen. Moreover, we explained to you how it's far less likely that, like, for example, local populations will harbour ISIS members if we allow this to happen naturally, right? In a way there's no foreign invasion. But when there's a foreign invasion, again, you have this us versus them mentality, which is likely to occur. Like, moreover, like, thirdly, on like why this is worse in the long run, right? Richard explains to you and gets no response whatsoever, right? Firstly, it necessarily has to be a prolonged invasion because of the fact that there's like they've not given us a timeline, and also because ISIS can very easily just move across the border and also just continue to like hold like small areas of territory, right? Secondly, what Richard tells you is that like for example, that the reason this won't be stable is that sunny Iraq, for example, doesn't adjoin a coast. Sunny ruled by military leaders. Because of that, and because of the fact there's no guarantee that any of this water and oil agreement will actually be adhered to, see South Sudan, right? You don't even get the peace even if all of the other things preceding that worked. We're sorry that this is a really bad idea. We wish it was a good idea, but it's not, so it can be proud to oppose.